Members, the House has resumed on the third reading of the Parental Leave and Employment Protection 6 months paid leave amendment bill. And before the dinner break, Jamie Lee Ross was speaking, and he doesn't wish to pursue the last call. I call Jacinda Ardern.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to say it was my pleasure to speak on this third reading. Usually at this point you have some sense of satisfaction that you might be at a point where your bill is about to pass, but sadly this is a highly unusual situation that the Parliament finds itself in today. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I was reflecting on the fact as I went to speak to a school group today where one of the questions from one of the students, these were intermediate age children, was what's been your most memorable moment in Parliament? Now I have to say two things sprung to mind. One was a protest here in Parliament. Another was standing next to my colleague Louisa Wall when marriage equality passed in this House. Moments like that stay in your mind as a Member of Parliament. I have to say when you're an opposition Member of Parliament, those memories are even more acute. We should have been having one of those memories here today because, Mr. Speaker, we have as a Parliament, as a collective, voted in favour of a bill that now will not pass through this House. Now that will seem extraordinary to people who are listening here this evening, Mr. Speaker, that we could have at a convention where you could have a majority speak their, share their will and still not have a bill pass through their House. Now, I might wish that that would happen, for instance, for a Brexit vote or something like that in the UK, but that's not the way that democracy works, unless you're the National Party and you've got the power of veto. And that's what we're seeing enacted in this House tonight, and that is a tragedy. But, Mr. Speaker, before I go any further, I do want to, as other speakers have, and rightly so, acknowledge the work of Sue Moroney. I was appalled to hear earlier today David Seymour question the motives of Sue Moroney in bringing this House to Parliament. I have known Sue for years. Anyone who knows Sue well knows that her motivation the entire time through this Parliament, but through this bill, has been about the best interest of families and babies. She has been absolutely unwavering in that goal. And so to hear that questioned in that way, I found really appalling, Mr. Speaker. So if nothing else, at least this third reading gives us the ability to show our support and thanks to Sue, but also to write the record in a couple of areas, because right up until last week, we've seen complete misinformation shared in this debate. And not that it mattered, because actually the majority of Parliament supported it anyway, but misinformation nonetheless. And I want to cover off a few of those points. The first was from David Seymour. It was a new argument that I hadn't heard consistently through this debate, but an argument nonetheless, and that was, why focus on the first 6 months? What about 20 years of development? An extraordinary point to raise. I think probably we've been quite consistent in this House at talking about the importance of the first 6 months of a child's life. In fact, as a party, we often talk about the first 3 years, but obviously when it comes to the research and evidence around breastfeeding and how important those first early months are, we honed in on 6 months as that step that we wanted to see passed here in this Parliament. So, of course, we want people to have time to parent, and that does go beyond 6 months. In fact, Mr. Seymour, if he chooses to look at our children's policy, will see that actually we've been targeting those first 3 years through things like Best Start. As for the first 20 years, actually, I'd have to point out that for the male brain, Mr. Seymour, it's 24. But I doubt many parents would want to advocate a policy that enables them to be home parenting that child right up until that point. There are different ages and stages. And you only need to look at the likes of the Brainwave Trust to know about that. Second question that's being raised in this House, why not a year? Well, actually, we've asked that question ourselves. We know that a year in an ideal world would be fantastic, but we drew a line in the sand. We said, look, we've got progression over time that we want to aim to. This is our trajectory. This is where we want to be. But in the here and now, this is where we believe it is possible to go now. We made that call. We've demonstrated to this House, to the country, that we were able to weigh up what was in the best interests of families and what was fiscally possible and what we hope to do in the future. And then on the other hand, they're on the one hand saying, why not a year? And on the other hand saying 6 months, 26 weeks is not affordable. Well, we've got so many examples on alternative spending that the government has decided that is affordable, I almost don't know where to start. But I think what probably puts it into perspective is that when you compare the costings for the paid parental leave bill that we're debating here tonight and the net spending budgeted for 2016-17, it basically represented 0.7% of the additional net spending for that budget. 0.7%. Now, what I would challenge that side of the House to do is show us your hierarchy of what the most important things to spend what we are able to as a collective on. Show me your hierarchy. Where's Defence Force spending in that hierarchy? Where are all of the other things that the government has decided is absolutely a priority? And how does that beat the needs of babies and their families? And we've seen other spending decisions, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that really lead me to question the priorities of the government. A couple of weeks ago, the Minister announced that she was cutting a program called Parents as First Teachers. It's been running since 1992. That will tell you that it's curious that it's been cancelled by this government. 1992. Plunket is one of the agencies that offers it, so is kindergarten associations. It's offered by educators, health providers, social services. After baby's born, it goes into the home. It helps low-income families, sole parent families, young families, families without support, the very people you think that we would want to be focusing on as a parliament. That's where it goes. Correction. The other member of the House just yelled out that it's going to Family Start. No, it's not. 7.2 million's been cut. Roughly 3 is going to Family Start. Where's the rest going? Where is the rest going? I can tell you it's going into a bureaucracy. As much as I support establishing the Ministry for Children, I do not support doing it at the expense of on-the-ground support for family and whānau. And that's exactly what this government is doing. So show me your hierarchy of needs, and I'll show you, and this House and this party will show you that paid parental leave can be done. We've also heard in this House that the support for this bill wasn't real. I was astounded when I heard one of the other members of this House, Alfred Naro, stand up and say that because there were form submissions, that the number of people who supported this bill somehow wasn't represented by those submissions. Well, I can tell you, a form submission still takes an individual to sit at their device, to read the petition, to enter in their name and their details, to proactively support something, an idea, a movement. Now, what is wrong with emphasising your view using that tool? What is wrong? And how does that lessen that, Mr. Speaker? So on this side of the House, we never questioned that every single one of those 6,817 submissions in support of this bill were real. In fact, they only represented the tip of the iceberg when it came to the strength of feeling behind this bill. I've spoken before in this House about a friend of mine who was desperately hoping that this government would change their mind. She's having a baby soon. She wanted to see the government show support for the experience that she's about to have with her partner. She never filled in a form submission, but she was watching. And she got a clear message when this government decided to veto a bill that Parliament ultimately wanted to support. Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that all members of the National Party actually oppose this bill. I would like to advocate that we give them the ability to vote on whether or not this veto should go ahead and whether this bill should in fact be enacted along with the will of Parliament. I think they should have their say. I've heard speeches in this House that have led me to believe that actually some of them would like the chance to vote, and particularly those who are parents themselves. I genuinely believe that not all of them are on board with what's happening. So let's give them that democratic right and allow them to exercise it. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, I would love to see history be made here tonight. I'd love this to be my next memorable parliamentary moment, and I know there's a lot of families who would want that too. So you may roll your eyes at me, Mr. Bennett. You may roll your eyes at me, but for a lot of people, this is important and it's a mark of what matters to this government. So why don't you put it to the vote? Let's make this a memorable day.